Tanya Jackson. In the summer of 1997, a woman was found in a wooded park on Long Island. She had been placed inside a plastic storage container along with her young daughter, and for nearly 3 decades, no one knew who either of them were. Her tattoo, a single bitten peach on her torso, would eventually become the only name investigators had for her. To them, she was Peaches, and her daughter was Baby Doe. And for years, that is where the case stopped. Tanya Denise Jackson was 26 years old at the time of her passing. She was a United States Army veteran, born in Alabama, and had served at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. She was estranged from her family and living transiently at the time. No one ever reported her missing. On June 28th of 1997, hikers moving through Hempstead Lake State Park in Lakeview, New York, came across a Rubbermaid container tucked into the trees. Inside were partial remains, a red towel, and a floral pillowcase. Additional skeletal remains, including those of her young daughter Tatiana, would not surface until April of 2011, this time along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. The location placed the case, wrongly, at the edge of one of the most infamous serial investigations in American history, the Long Island serial killer inquiry that would eventually lead to the arrest of Rex Heuermann. For years, investigators assumed Peaches and Baby Doe were connected to that killer. They were not. The case sat unmoving until 2020, when evidence was submitted to Othram, a forensic genomics laboratory in Texas. Othram built what is known as a forensic-grade genome sequencing profile from the remains, and the FBI's investigative genetic genealogy team began following the leads that profile produced. In April of 2025, the identities of Peaches and Baby Doe were finally announced. She had been Tanya Jackson all along, and her young daughter had been Tatiana Marie Dykes. The birth certificate led investigators to a name. Andrew Dykes was listed as Tatiana's biological father. He was a 20-year Army veteran who had served alongside Jackson at Fort Sam Houston. He was married at the time of their relationship, a father of 2 children of his own. And he had specialized during his service as a military instructor in anatomy and physiology, with recognized expertise in the skeletal, muscular, and digestive systems of the human body. In October of 2024, investigators followed Dykes to a Charlie's Cheesesteaks restaurant in Tampa, Florida, and quietly recovered a discarded drink cup and straw. The DNA from that abandoned cup was tested. It was included as a contributor to the DNA recovered from Jackson's remains. How could a man who had served 2 decades in the United States military, who had raised a family, and who had built a quiet civilian life in Ruskin, Florida, remain undetected for 28 years? On December 3rd of 2025, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office arrested Andrew Dykes, then 66 years old. He was extradited to New York and arraigned in Nassau County on December 18th on a single charge of murder in the 2nd degree, an A1 felony carrying a possible sentence of 25 years to life in prison. He was charged only in the passing of Tanya Jackson. He has not been charged in connection with his young daughter's passing. He pleaded not guilty and was remanded, and his defense signaled early that it would challenge the reliability of the newer DNA techniques used to identify him. His next court date was set for January 16th of 2026. As of 2026, Andrew Dykes remains in custody, awaiting trial. He is presumed innocent under the law. Tanya Jackson and her young daughter have been returned to their names, and for the first time in almost 3 decades, they are no longer known as Peaches and Baby Doe. The next story does not begin with a mystery about who committed the crime. It begins with a mystery about the victim herself, a small child whose remains sat inside a steel barrel for more than 40 years before anyone could say who she was. Rhea Rasmussen. For 4 decades, 4 sets of remains recovered from 2 steel barrels sat as one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in New England. A woman and 3 young girls, none of whom carried a name. When investigators finally identified the smallest of them, they made a discovery almost no cold case has ever produced. The child had been the killer's own biological daughter. The first barrel was found near Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, in 1985. A hunter came across a 55-gallon container in the woods. Inside were the remains of an adult woman and a young girl. Investigators searched the surrounding area for years. Then, in the year 2000, a second barrel was discovered nearby. Inside were the remains of 2 more young girls. All 4 had lost their lives sometime between 1978 and 1981. And for decades, none of them had a name. The woman was eventually identified as Marlice Honeychurch. 2 of the girls were her daughters, Marie Vaughn and Sarah McWaters. But the 4th child, the smallest of them, did not match any of the others. She was called Jane Allenstown Doe of the year 2000, the middle child, and her identity would take another 25 years to uncover. The perpetrator, on the other hand, had already been identified. His name was Terry Peter Rasmussen, a serial offender who moved through a rotating series of aliases, including Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, and Gordon Jensen. He had passed away in a California prison in 2010 while serving a sentence for taking the life of his girlfriend, Amanda Lynn Schumann Diza. What remained unknown was how the middle child fit into his story. The breakthrough came through the DNA Doe Project, which partnered with the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit in 2024. Building on prior work by Astrea Forensics and Firebird Forensics, the team constructed a family tree of roughly 25,000 names, tracing ancestors back to the 1780s. Slowly, the tree pointed in a direction no one had considered. The middle child's mother was a woman named Pepper Reed. A 1976 birth record in Orange County, California, filled in the rest. The child's name was Rhea Rasmussen. Bode Technology, working under a Child Justice Project grant from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, confirmed the identification. The public announcement came in September of 2025. Hair samples then confirmed the last piece of the puzzle. Terry Rasmussen was the child's biological father. How does a man travel across the country under false names, raise a child under one identity, take a life under another, and leave behind a daughter no one even knew existed? There were no legal proceedings to pursue. Rasmussen had passed away in prison in 2010, 15 years before the child was ever named. He was never charged in her passing or in the passing of the mother and daughters found beside her. The convictions he did receive in California were entirely unrelated to the Bear Brook remains. The New Hampshire Attorney General's office confirmed that the case was closed with the identification. Investigators continue to search for Pepper Reed, the mother, who has never been located and is presumed to have been another Rasmussen victim. Another suspected victim, Denise Baudin, also remains missing. There are no known photographs of Rhea. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children produced a facial reconstruction so that she would, at least, have a face attached to her name. As of 2026, all 4 Bear Brook victims have been identified. Terry Rasmussen has been dead for 16 years. Pepper Reed is still officially listed as a missing person. And the smallest of the 4 barrel victims is finally on record under the name her mother gave her at birth. The next case moves out of the barrels and into a Florida swamp. where a woman lay unidentified for nearly 4 decades. She was not the person investigators originally believed her to be, and her story became one of the first cold cases in the country solved through a specialized effort focused on transgender victims of violence. Pamela Lee Walton. In September of 1988, a body was found dragged 30 feet off a rural road in the green swamp of Lake County, Florida. The remains had mummified in the humid Florida air. For nearly 37 years, she had no name, no confirmed cause of death, and no known family looking for her. Investigators called her Julie Doe. She would turn out to be Pamela Lee Walton, and her identification would come to represent something the field of forensics had rarely, until then, taken seriously. Pamela had been born in Kentucky and placed for adoption at birth. Her given name at birth was Lee Allen Walton. Later in life, she transitioned and lived as Pamela. She was estimated by the Lake County Sheriff's Office to be in her mid-20s at the time of her passing, though the DNA Doe Project would later estimate a birth date somewhere in the late 1950s or early 1960s, which would have placed her closer to her 30s. The discrepancy has never been resolved. Her remains were discovered on September 25th of 1988, along County Road 474 near Claremont. Her skirt and pantyhose had been partially removed. Investigators suspected a sexual assault. The manner of death, however, could not be determined. Cause of death was listed simply as undetermined, and it has remained so. For decades, forensic assumptions worked against her. Investigators assumed the remains belonged to a cisgender woman. Hormone therapy had altered her pelvic bones in ways that were misread at the time as evidence of a prior pregnancy. Isotope testing suggested she had grown up in Florida, which was wrong. It was not until 2015, when a DNA test finally revealed a Y chromosome, that investigators understood they were looking at a transgender victim. That single detail changed everything about how her case was worked from that point forward. The DNA Doe Project took the case in 2018 in partnership with the Trans Doe Task Force. It took years. Sample after sample failed to produce a workable extraction. A usable profile was finally obtained in January of 2020. Genealogists traced her ancestry to central Kentucky, specifically to Madison, Fayette, Garrard, and Mercer counties. Living relatives eventually agreed to submit their own DNA for comparison. In February of 2025, the identification was confirmed. The Lake County Sheriff's Office made the public announcement in March. Who had taken her life? That question, unlike the question of her name, has never been answered. There is no suspect and no arrest. The Lake County Sheriff's Office continues to classify the manner of death as undetermined and continues to investigate. This is one of the more unusual outcomes of the recent DNA revolution. Genetic genealogy solved the mystery of who the victim was without answering the question of who was responsible for her passing. In cases where a killer's DNA was left behind, the technique reaches upward, tracing the perpetrator through family trees. In this case, the profile it built was Pamela's own. Advocates who have followed the case argue that Pamela's identification also reflects a shift in how transgender victims of violence are treated by forensic institutions. For nearly 4 decades, she was misidentified in life and misidentified in death. The Trans Doe Task Force, formed specifically to address that pattern, was a central partner in restoring her name. As of 2026, Pamela Lee Walton has her name back. The investigation into her passing remains open, and no suspect has ever been named. The Lake County Sheriff's Office continues to ask that anyone with information about a woman who may have passed through the Claremont area in the summer of 1988 come forward. The next case moves the story north to a college town in Vermont, into a summer apartment where a young teacher was found in her bedroom. The man who took her life was interviewed by police, walked away, and lived out the rest of his years in another country under a religious identity most of his neighbors would never have guessed at. Rita Curran. In July of 1971, a second-grade teacher in Burlington, Vermont, was found lifeless in her apartment. She had put up a violent struggle. Beside her right arm on the floor was a single unsmoked cigarette. For more than 50 years, no one knew who had left it there. The man who eventually did was not a serial killer, not a stranger from out of town, and not someone she had ever formally met. He lived 2 floors above her. Rita Curran was 24 years old, a teacher at Milton Elementary School and a graduate student at the University of Vermont. She had studied at Trinity College, spent her summers working as a chambermaid at a local motel, and shared her apartment on Brooks Avenue with roommates. On the night of July 19th into the morning of July the 20th of 1971, she was beaten, sexually assaulted, and asphyxiated in her own bedroom. A returning roommate found her at first light. The apartment door had been left unlocked. Burlington police chased hundreds of leads through the summer and into the fall. Ted Bundy was considered as a possible suspect, given his birthplace at the Elizabeth Lund home, which sat near the motel where Curran worked her summer job. He was eventually ruled out. Every viable name investigators developed was worked and then set aside. The case sat unmoving for more than 4 decades. In 2014, the cigarette butt was finally sent to the New York City office of the chief medical examiner. It had been a Lark brand cigarette, unsmoked, sitting undisturbed next to Rita's body since the morning she was found. A male DNA profile was successfully developed and entered into the national database. It did not match anyone. Whoever had left the cigarette beside her had never been convicted of a felony that would have placed him in the system. 5 years later, in 2019, the profile was handed to C.C. Moore at Parabon Nanolabs. Moore worked in a technique known as investigative genetic genealogy, the same method that had cracked the Golden State Killer case a year earlier. She would later say that after 5 decades of investigation, it took only a matter of hours to narrow the profile down to a single name: William DeRoos. A half-brother, still living, agreed to submit a DNA sample for comparison. DNA Labs International then confirmed the presence of DeRoos's DNA on Curran's ripped housecoat. The announcement came in February of 2023. What Burlington police revealed at that press conference was, for many people, the most disturbing part of the case. DeRoos had lived 2 floors above Rita in the same apartment building. He had a criminal record. He had married a woman named Michelle Roach only weeks before the killing. After Rita's passing, DeRoos and his new wife told police they had spent the night together. That mutual alibi was the reason he was never treated as a serious suspect. When investigators re-interviewed his ex-wife in September of 2022, she admitted she had lied. She said DeRoos had asked her to stick to the story, telling her that he had a criminal record and could not afford further scrutiny. How does a killer disappear for 5 decades without ever going to prison for what he did? In the case of William DeRoos, the answer is that he left the country. He fled to Thailand shortly after the killing and became a Buddhist monk. He would eventually return to the United States, remarry in San Francisco, and continue a pattern of violence that included stabbing a female friend without apparent reason and strangling his second wife while telling her he had thought he was stabbing her. He passed away of a morphine overdose in a San Francisco hotel room in 1986 at the age of 46. The Chittenden County State's Attorney, Sarah George, reviewed the DNA evidence in 2023 and concluded there was probable cause to have charged DeRoos with aggravated first-degree murder. She stated publicly that she believed she could have won a conviction at trial. His former wife was not charged for the false alibi. Burlington's acting police chief noted that lying to the police on its own is not a crime under Vermont law. As of 2026, the case is officially closed. William DeRoos has been dead for 40 years. He was never charged, never tried, and never spent a day in prison for what he did to Rita Curran. The next case brings the story down to a Texas apartment complex in the mid-1980s, where a young airline ticket agent was found in her home. Her killer lived less than 1,000 feet away, and no one had ever considered him. Janet Love. In April of 1986, a young Delta Airlines ticket agent failed to arrive for her shift at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. Two of her co-workers went to her apartment to check on her. Inside, they found her in her own bed. She had been sexually assaulted and shot in the head. For 35 years, the DNA sample recovered from her home sat inside the national database without a single match. Janet Elaine Love was 32 years old. She had grown up in Louisiana and moved to Bedford, Texas, in 1985 for a job with Delta. She had been in North Texas for less than a year at the time of her passing. She was found in her apartment on L. Don Dodson Drive on April 24th of 1986, after failing to appear for her scheduled shift. 15 detectives worked her case over the years. A DNA profile had been developed from the crime scene early on and entered into the national database. Every known serial offender within striking distance of North Texas was checked against it. Every possible connection was traced. Every match returned negative. For nearly 4 decades, the profile sat in the system, waiting for someone whose DNA had never been collected. That changed in late 2020. The Texas Department of Public Safety received a federal grant through the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, a program administered by the Department of Justice, which funded the use of forensic genetic genealogy on cold cases. Janet's DNA profile was sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. A genealogist began constructing a family tree. 2 family members were eventually located and agreed to submit their own DNA samples for kinship comparison. The results narrowed the profile to a single individual. In September of 2021, the Bedford Police Department publicly identified her killer. His name was Ray Anthony Chapa. Chapa had been 19 years old at the time of the killing. He had lived less than 1,000 feet from Janet Love's apartment, inside a neighboring complex. He had no known connection to her. There is no evidence they had ever spoken, no record of any prior contact between them. He had a minor criminal history involving theft and drug possession, but nothing violent. He had never been on the suspect list. He had never been questioned. Chief Jeff Williams of the Bedford Police Department stated that his department was 100% confident in the identification. But how does a killer avoid detection for 35 years while living less than 1,000 feet from where he committed the crime? The answer, for Ray Chapa, is that he never gave the state a reason to collect his DNA. He was never convicted of a felony that would have placed him in the national database. His minor offenses did not trigger a sample. And so, for the entire span of Janet Love's cold case, his DNA sat undocumented, while the profile from her apartment sat in the system with nothing to compare against. There would be no prosecution. Ray Chapa passed away of a terminal illness in January of 2021, roughly 9 months before he was publicly named as her killer. He was in his mid-50s at the time. The investigation, however, has not closed. Chapa had lived at various points in Chicago and in Montana. The FBI has since been examining unsolved sexual assaults in the areas where he lived, working from the theory that Janet Love may not have been his only victim. North Texas detectives have already connected him to additional sexual assaults across the region. The full scope of his history may not be known for years. As of 2026, Janet Love's case is officially closed. Her killer is deceased. The federal grant that funded her case has since been used to pursue additional cold cases across Texas. Her mother lived long enough to learn her daughter's killer's name. The story of DNA cracking a nearly 40-year-old case in Texas is only the halfway point. 5 more cases remain, carrying the same thread forward into a 1967 killing in Bristol that would become the oldest solved cold case in British history, into a Santa Cruz river where a chef was found the morning after a first date she had declined, and into a 1972 case whose perpetrator was himself beaten and set on fire more than 4 decades before DNA ever unmasked him. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Joette Marie Smith. She was a chef who had built her own restaurant, known for feeding strangers and giving away food to people who could not pay. In March of 1983, she was found floating in a river outside Santa Cruz, wearing almost nothing. Her clothing was found on the bank, a quarter-mile upstream. The man responsible had asked her on a date at her own restaurant just weeks earlier, and she had turned him down. Joette Marie Smith was 33 years old. She had grown up in a Polish Catholic family in Nebraska and moved west to open her own place in Ben Lomond, a small town tucked into the Santa Cruz Mountains. Her restaurant was called Buffalo Gals. Friends remembered her for feeding anyone who came in hungry, whether they could pay or not. On the night of March 27th of 1983, Joette was last seen leaving Henfling's Tavern late in the evening. 2 days later, on March 29th, her body was found caught on a tree limb in the San Lorenzo River. She had been sexually assaulted. Her clothing was found on the riverbank about a quarter-mile upstream. Her death was ruled a homicide. Investigators interviewed dozens of people in the weeks that followed. In 1988, 5 years after the killing, a name entered the case file. Eric Drummond had asked Joette on a date at her restaurant not long before her death, and she had declined. He was flagged as a suspect. But there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime, and he was never arrested. The case sat, largely untouched, for the next 34 years. In August of 2022, the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office sent Joette's dress to the California Department of Justice DNA laboratory for re-examination. Semen was recovered from multiple areas of the dress, and a male DNA profile was successfully developed. That same month, the sheriff's office obtained a DNA sample from Eric Drummond. It matched. By that point, Drummond had lived a long and violent life. He had been convicted of an attempted homicide and assault in Redding in 1983, the same year Joette was killed, and had served 16 months. In 1988, the same year he had first been named as a suspect in her case, he had been convicted of a violent assault and car theft in Nevada, and had served 4 years. His criminal history stretched across California and Nevada, and included multiple convictions for sexual assault. Friends who had known Joette in the weeks before her death would later share a detail that took on a different weight after the identification. She had told them, in the weeks leading up to that March, that she felt her life was going to be cut short. She had given away keepsakes. She had called old friends just to tell them she cared about them. How does a man walk into a woman's restaurant, ask her on a date, get turned down, and then wait 5 years before his name even enters the case file? There would be no trial. As the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office prepared an arrest warrant in early September of 2022, Eric Drummond took his own life in the hills of Sierra County. He was 64 years old at the time. The sheriff's office publicly stated that the evidence would have supported a conviction had he lived to stand trial. As of 2026, the Joette Marie Smith case is officially closed. Eric Drummond has been deceased for nearly 4 years. Buffalo Gals, the restaurant she built and ran, is remembered locally as the place where she fed anyone who came through the door hungry. The next case moves the story across the Atlantic Ocean to a working-class neighborhood in Bristol, England, and back to 1967, into what would eventually become the oldest solved cold case in British legal history. Louisa Dunn. In June of 1967, a 75-year-old widow was found lifeless in her home in Bristol, England. Neighbors that night had heard her scream. The investigation that followed collected nearly 19,000 palm and fingerprints from local men and boys and never found her killer. 58 years later, a forensic scientist swabbed a blue skirt kept in police storage since 1967, and Britain got its oldest solved cold case. Louisa Jane Dunn was a twice-widowed pensioner living alone at 58 Britannia Road in the eastern area of Bristol. Her first husband, Edwin Parker, known as Teddy, had been a Labour city councillor, and she had been expected to become Bristol's mayoress before his death in 1945. She had spent the last 2 decades of her life on her own. Sometime between June 26th and June 28th of 1967, Louisa was raped and killed in her own home. She was found by a neighbor on June 28th. The cause of death was strangulation and asphyxiation. Multiple neighbors told police they had heard a woman's frightening scream during the night in question. The 1967 investigation was extensive. Avon and Somerset police collected roughly 19,000 palm and fingerprints from local men and boys during a door-to-door canvass of the neighborhood. Every one of them was cleared. The case was formally reopened multiple times over the following decades, and every time, investigators reached the same dead end. The killer was not in the neighborhood they had canvassed. They had been looking in the wrong place. In 2023, the Avon and Somerset Major Crime Review Team reopened the file once more. In May of 2024, Louisa's blue skirt, which had been preserved in evidence storage since the year of her death, was sent to a modern forensic laboratory. A full DNA profile was recovered. According to the Crown Prosecution Service, the DNA recovered from the crime scene in 1967 was 1 billion times more likely to belong to a specific man than it was to belong to anyone else. His name was Ryland Headley. He had been a railway worker living in Ipswich at the time of the killing, and he had never lived in the Bristol neighborhood police had canvassed. He was outside the door-to-door area. His DNA had been added to the national database in 2012 for an unrelated matter, and it had been sitting there for more than a decade, waiting for someone to run a comparison. 4 fingerprint experts also matched a partial palm print from a rear window at the crime scene to Headley's hand. Headley had 2 prior convictions on his record. In the late 1970s, he had pleaded guilty to raping 2 elderly women in Ipswich, one 79 years old and the other 84. He had been sentenced to life for those crimes, but the sentence had been reduced on appeal to 7 years, and he had served roughly 2. How does a man rape and kill an elderly woman in her own home, go on to rape 2 more elderly women a decade later, plead guilty, serve 2 years, and then live freely into his 90s? His trial began at Bristol Crown Court on June 16th of 2025. Because nearly every original witness was dead, the prosecution had to rely on decades-old written statements admitted into court as hearsay. His prior convictions from Ipswich were also admitted as evidence of what English law calls bad character, on the ground that the similarities to the Dunn attack were too great to ignore. On June 30th of 2025, Ryland Headley was convicted of rape and murder. He was 92 years old at the time of his conviction, believed to be the oldest person ever convicted of murder in Britain. On July 1st of 2025, Mr. Justice Derek Sweeting sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. The judge told him directly that he would die in prison. As of 2026, Ryland Headley is serving his sentence in the British prison system. Norfolk and Suffolk police have opened reviews into other unsolved killings in his area, including the killings of Edna Harvey in 1984, Doris Shelley in 1993, and Karen Hales in 1993, to determine whether he may have been responsible for any of them. The story now returns to Texas, and to a killing that stayed hidden for nearly 4 decades inside a single family. The DNA that finally cracked it did not point outward to a stranger. It pointed inward to a name the family had quietly suspected for years. Barbara Villarreal. In November of 1986, a woman was stabbed to death in her home in Garland, Texas. Her husband said he had heard her screaming, run to help, and found intruders attacking her. He was cleared. Nearly 40 years later, DNA would reveal that the killer had not been a random intruder at all. He was Barbara's own brother-in-law. Barbara Faye Villarreal was in her late 20s, described by CBS News as 27 years old at the time of her killing. She lived in Garland with her husband. On November 7th of 1986, she was stabbed to death inside her home in the 3600 block of Colbath Street. A large kitchen knife was found near her body. Her husband told police that night that he had been in another part of the house when he heard her screaming. He said he had run to help her and encountered intruders in the process of attacking her. He was interviewed at length and eventually cleared. Suspect blood was recovered from outside the home. That blood was entered into the national database and remained there, without a match, for decades. The FBI and Garland Police Department worked leads in both the United States and Mexico. Barbara's husband was killed in a shootout in Mexico in 1988, 2 years after her death, and the trail effectively went cold. Investigators had a DNA profile they could not match, a husband they had cleared, and no other suspects. In the years that followed, Garland police applied investigative genetic genealogy to the crime scene blood. The results were not what they expected. The DNA did not point to a stranger. It pointed to a close relative of Barbara's own husband. Specifically, the profile matched a brother. Detectives working the case at the time made a striking observation. The original 1986 investigators had never even known that Barbara's husband had a brother. The family relationship had simply never come up in the initial canvass, and no one had thought to ask. His name was Liborio Canales, a Mexican citizen, and by the time investigators identified him, he was 85 years old. Canales was located after crossing the United States-Mexico border to visit family in New Mexico. On July 18th of 2023, the FBI and the Lovington Police Department arrested him in Lovington, New Mexico. In interviews after his arrest, Canales confessed. He said he had killed Barbara over a family dispute. How does a killing sit inside a single family for nearly 4 decades, with the killer walking freely across the border, while the woman's own mother waited for an answer that only came when the mother was in her 90s? Canales was extradited to Texas and booked into the Dallas County Jail on August 18th of 2023. he pleaded guilty to the killing. On March 12th of 2024, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Given his age, the sentence was effectively a life sentence. The Dallas County District Attorney's Office publicly noted that this was their first murder conviction obtained using investigative genetic genealogy. Criminal District Attorney John Creuzot stated that the technique was no longer the future of solving violent crimes, but very much the present, and that Dallas would continue to lead the country in using it. The lead prosecutor, Leighton D'Antoni, noted that Barbara's mother, who was 93 years old at the time of the conviction, had lived to see the day her daughter's killer stood before a court. As of 2026, Liborio Canales is serving his 20-year sentence in the Texas prison system. His conviction remains the first of its kind in Dallas County. Barbara Villarreal's family, after nearly 40 years of quiet suspicion, finally has an official answer. The story now returns to California, into a Sacramento apartment complex where a young court reporter was found in her bedroom the morning after a night attack. Her killer was interviewed within days of the crime, walked away with an alibi, and lived for nearly 3 more decades before DNA finally connected him to what he had done. Nancy Benelak. In October of 1970, a 28-year-old court reporter was found in her Sacramento apartment. She had been stabbed more than 30 times and nearly decapitated. She was engaged to be married in a matter of weeks. For 52 years, the killer's blood sat inside the national DNA database with no name attached to it. When the name finally came, it belonged to the neighbor police had already interviewed within days of the killing. Nancy Marie Benelak was 28 years old. She had grown up in Grass Valley, California, and worked as a court reporter in Sacramento County Juvenile Court. She was engaged to Faris Salami, the county's chief assistant public defender. Their wedding had been set for November 28th of 1970. On the night of October 25th into the morning of October 26th of 1970, someone entered her second-story apartment at the corner of Arden Way and Bell Avenue in Sacramento. The killer came in through a sliding balcony door she had left slightly ajar for her cat. She was stabbed more than 30 times. She was found the next day after she failed to arrive at work. The killer had cut himself during the attack and left a blood trail leading out of the apartment. That blood would eventually become the piece of physical evidence that closed the case. But not for a very long time. Sacramento County detectives interviewed roughly 500 people in the month after the killing. Every one of them was eventually eliminated. Early theories linked the case to the killing of a Sacramento nurse named Judith Hikari, whose body had been found earlier that same year, in March of 1970, not far away. Investigators suspected the 2 cases might have been the work of the same person. Decades later, DNA would show they were not. In 2004, a full DNA profile was developed from the blood trail and entered into the national database. For 18 years, it did not match anyone. In November of 2019, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office and District Attorney's Office launched a forensic genetic genealogy investigation. In 2021, the case received a prosecuting cold cases using DNA grant from the Federal Bureau of Justice Assistance. Genealogists spent 2 years constructing a family tree from the profile. In the end, a cooperating relative agreed to submit a DNA sample for kinship comparison. The comparison confirmed the source of the blood trail. On July 21st of 2022, the Sheriff's Office publicly identified the killer as Richard John Davis. Davis had been 27 years old at the time of the killing. He had lived in the same apartment complex as Nancy Benelak. He had been interviewed by police within days of her death, and his roommate had given him an alibi. That alibi had held Davis had gone on to live for nearly 3 more decades. He had no prior violent history. His most serious previous offense had been a driving under the influence charge. Investigators emphasized one detail from the crime scene that had always suggested premeditation. Davis had covered his fingertips with masking tape before entering Nancy's apartment. He had planned to avoid leaving prints. He had not planned on cutting himself and leaving blood. How does a man commit a killing this violent, walk away with an alibi from a roommate, live for another 27 years, and never once show any pattern of similar behavior? There would be no trial. Richard John Davis had passed away in 1997, in his 50s, of complications related to alcoholism. His body had been cremated. The identification came a full 25 years after his death. As of 2026, the Nancy Benelak case is officially closed. Richard John Davis has been deceased for nearly 3 decades. The DNA that finally connected him to the crime, and the tape he had wrapped around his fingertips to hide his prints, together tell the story of a man who had planned every part of that night except the wound he gave himself on the way out. The final case moves the story to Indiana, into a summer road trip in 1972, and into the ending that awaited the man responsible for it 13 years before DNA would ever place his name on the case file. Phyllis Baylor. In July of 1972, a young mother left Indianapolis to drive her small daughter to visit her parents in Bluffton, Indiana. She never arrived. Her body was found in a ditch the next morning, and her young daughter was found sitting beside her unharmed. For 53 years, no one knew who was responsible. When investigators finally identified him, they discovered that he had been beaten to death and set on fire in a Detroit alley almost 4 decades earlier. Phyllis Baylor was 26 years old. She was raised in the Bluffton area of Indiana and lived in Indianapolis at the time of her death. Her family called her by a middle name, Jean. Her young daughter, Jody, was traveling with her. On the evening of Friday, July 7th of 1972, Phyllis left Indianapolis around 8 in the evening, driving a borrowed car north to visit her parents. She never arrived. The following morning, around 10:30, her car was found abandoned with its hood up on northbound Interstate 69 in Grant County, Indiana. About an hour later, at 11:37 in the morning, a passerby found her body in a ditch on West Road just north of Schoaf Road in Allen County. She had been sexually assaulted and shot to death. Her young daughter, physically unharmed, was found sitting beside her. DNA testing did not exist in 1972. For decades, the case went through the traditional channels of investigation. A main suspect was developed early on, questioned repeatedly, and never charged. When a partial DNA profile was eventually developed from Phyllis's clothing, it eliminated that suspect entirely. The case then sat for another 53 years. In 2024, the Indiana State Police Laboratory revisited the evidence. Using more advanced techniques, they developed what investigators described as a much stronger DNA profile from her clothing. The Indiana State Police Cold Case Team and the Allen County Police Department partnered with Identifinders International, a California laboratory founded by Colleen Fitzpatrick, one of the pioneers of forensic genetic genealogy in the United States. By early 2025, the identification was made. On April 16th of 2025, the Indiana State Police publicly announced the killer's name. He was Fred Allen Lieneman. Lieneman had been 25 years old at the time of the killing. He was from the Anderson, Indiana area and had a significant criminal history, including car theft and a prior arrest in Florida. Investigators found no known personal connection between him and Phyllis Baylor. He had not been on any prior suspect list. His DNA had simply been recovered from her clothing. How does a killer stay hidden for more than half a century without a single tip, a single confession, or a single break in the case, only to be found waiting inside a system he had never once been placed into? Fred Lieneman had died in April of 1985, 40 years before DNA identified him. He was 37 years old at the time of his death. According to Detroit police records and a 1985 Detroit news clipping shared publicly by Indiana State Police, Lieneman had been beaten with a baseball bat during an argument over property in Detroit. Both of his arms had been broken. His face had been spray-painted silver. He had then been thrown into a dumpster and set on fire while still alive. Two men, Clifford Copley and Kevin Reese, had been charged with murder in that killing. The Indiana State Police stated at the April 2025 press conference that if Fred Lieneman were still alive, the Allen County Prosecutor's Office would have charged him with the killing of Phyllis Baylor. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the founder of Identifinders International, publicly stated that Phyllis's case was another example of a homicide that would never have been solved without forensic genetic genealogy. As of 2026, the Phyllis Baylor case is closed. Fred Lieneman has been dead for 41 years. Her young daughter, who was with her that summer morning, has since grown into adulthood. The mother she lost that night has, at last, a name attached to the man who took her. That closes out 10 of the strangest cold cases DNA has ever brought back to light. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.